Hello everyone and welcome to Module 3, EDUC 729. At this point we have done 2 modules already, and as a reminder, as always, please just try and stay on top of the learning objectives. The way this works best is, you check the learning objectives, the assignments before the week begins, but I know you're busy from the first 2 modules as well. So just try and stay on top of things and communicate with me, the instructor. So that's our starting point as always, and this particular module is about how do we learn, but there's some things we need to talk about before we get into actual learning theory and things like that. The first one is setting goals, and it's my privilege to be out in schools a lot, and I do see goals that sometimes aren't measurable. But before we begin even talking about that, how about we make goals and objectives that are reasonable, achievable, and you always have a baseline. And one of my things is you have to know where a student is before you know where they are going, and that doesn't mean geographically. It means you need to know what their spelling performance is, reading performance, math performance, whatever the case may be, so you can actually measure it. So we always get a baseline, which is kind of like our pre-intervention setting, our pre-intervention state of the behavior. So try and remember that. You have to know where a student is before you know where they are going, and it's always important to get that baseline. So setting goals kind of starts there. Behavioral objectives, at a minimum, we're talking learner behavior conditions and criteria. But as stated in your textbook, if you want to really go beyond that and make sure they are, behavior specific, observable, measurable, states the behavior to build, and actually specifies things that you can see. As I was alluding to a second ago, I sometimes see goals and objectives that talk about so-and-so will increase social skills. I don't know what that means. That can mean a lot of different things. So general level of difficulty as well. Make sure you really nail it down. Engaged time looks like this. In-seat looks like this. Academic performance looks like this. Correctness looks like this. So you have your standards, general level of difficulty, things like that. Another point before we move on is curriculum alignment. And I know many of you work in local schools. Guess what? Most of the schools I've been in have excellent curriculum alignment. And what that means is the stated goals align with what's going on in the classroom, and that aligns with what's being assessed. So curriculum alignment is also pretty important when we talk about overall goals and things like that. Are we actually teaching what we're supposed to be teaching? Is it actually happening in the classroom? Are we assessing what we're supposed to be teaching? So curriculum alignment has the written, taught, and tested curriculum all aligned. So that's something you might want to take a look at as well. Levels of performance and learning, I think you might already know this, but we start with acquisition. And a controversy has always been, I have always thought that maintenance should come right after acquisition. But many of these paradigms, and it is a paradigm, beware of paradigms, have fluency next and then maintenance. I think you have to kind of keep something before you become better in doing that particular skill. So I always have it acquisition, maintenance, fluency, generalization. Or to put it in layman's terms, get it, keep it, get better at it, and use it all over the place. So you might prefer the layman's terms, which is get it, keep it, get better at it, and use it all over the place. Think about where your students are in any particular domain. Are they at the acquisition phase? Are they at the maintenance phase? Fluency? Are we working on generalization? One skill or one level of performance that we really need to take a look at sometimes is maintenance. Do our students actually keep the skills that we teach? We have non-maintenance. I always use the example of the first aid or CPR classes, Red Cross, American Heart Association, whatever. If you've only taken that course once, do you really have any clue what to do 8 months later? Probably not, because you haven't practiced it. You might not maintain it. Other things we acquire, we maintain for a lifetime. Swimming, riding a bike, things like that. So maintenance, I think, is very, very important for our students. They keep skills, then become more fluent in it, and then generalize it. And as you know, generalization can be a real struggle for many of our students. So that's the levels of performance and learning. 3 other levels of performance are knowing, problem solving, and creating. And I always try not to, read things to you off of these slides, but, knowing, most students are going to kind of like know stuff, recall. In your own situation on the pre-test, mostly on the post-test, not a protest, a post-test, you'll be doing recall. You'll recall some of these things, apply some of these things. So knowing is kind of convergent. Problem solving is we're teaching kids new ways to approach problems, problem solving skills, things like that. And creating, and I just have examples here for you, or they might write different passages. So basically what you're looking at is knowing, problem solving, and creating is another way to look at student performance. So let's get into how we actually learn. The definition that I think is the best, and that's only because I'm a behavior analyst, is we see something. There's some kind of observable result from interacting in the environment or being exposed to our teaching or participating in that activity with us. There's some kind of change or increase in behavior. That's observable. That's observable. So also, it includes both overt and covert actions. And we don't really talk a lot about covert, Freudian's black box, like we talked about in Module 1, because we can't see that. We can't feel it, we can't taste it, we can't measure it. We can, however, measure overt behavior. The number of problems the student produced correct, the number of tantrums, the duration of the tantrums, things like that. That's overt behavior, how long they were in seat. So it includes both overt and covert actions with learning, but we kind of focus on the overt because we can actually measure that. Can people report covert activity? Of course, but you really can't measure it. It's hard to get inter-rater reliability, things like that. The vast majority also, if you know from Unit 1 and Module 1, I should say, and Module 2, the vast majority of what we're looking at academically is operant. It's learning. It's learning. It's not respondent. Respondent behavior relies a lot less on learning. So the vast majority of what we teach and what kids continue to use after we teach them is operant behavior. So a little bit more, what we teach does not automatically arise sometimes from the antecedent stimuli. So we really need to make sure, and we'll get into this when we get into antecedent teaching, that students can respond to the appropriate antecedents, that SD, that green light. And what we teach does not automatically arise from antecedent stimuli. So it's important that you know that as well. Also, two-term behavior and consequence. We talked about this a little bit in an earlier module. Three-term, think about this for teaching. Sometimes are there behaviors that occur and then we praise, and we didn't necessarily occasion those behaviors. Well, that would be like a two-term contingency. The students do this, we provide this. The three-term is more applicable to teaching, wherein we occasion the correct response or correct responding or engaged behavior or whatever, and then we provide a consequence. And that's the ABC of teaching. Occasion, behavior occurs, reinforce it. So postcedents, just as a reminder, follow behavior but are not necessarily consequences. Consequences produce that change. Behavior increase, it had to be positive or negative reinforcement. Punishment produces that decrease in the future probability. They're not necessarily consequence. Postcedents are just things that follow the behavior. And that's probably a new term for you. So when we talk about reinforcement, this is something that is a consequence. It follows the behavior and increases, like it says, the likelihood and probability. So it's when you think about it, the only environmental change, like there's something there, put there that wasn't there before. Once again, behavior can only do two things, whether it's academic, social, adaptive, whatever kind of behavior. It can put something there as a consequence that wasn't there before, or take away, lessen, or eliminate something that was there. So this is the only environmental change that actually strengthens behavior. It's defined functionally. And if you see that functionality or that functional relationship, praising for correct academic responding is my example here, and you see a connection there, you see that increase, then you might have a positive reinforcer. So pay attention to what you want to see more of in the future academically. That engagement, that actual learning, the demonstration and evidence that kids give you that they have learned something, they can do it. So that's a little bit about reinforcement. When we talk about reinforcement in more general terms, it should be immediate. When you see something praiseworthy, you should immediately praise. It's also not reinforcement unless the student's willing to work to access it. And the reason I put some asterisks after this novelty of reinforcement is I'd really like you to consider not saying good job all the time. A lot of teachers say good job, good job, good job, good job. And what happens is kids satiate on it and it loses power. So you can certainly vary what you say to children, how you deliver it, your tone, volume, and cadence of voice, novelty of reinforcement. It's also important to note that some students have unusual reinforcer preferences, and we just have to figure out what it is. So everybody kind of likes something, you just have to find out what it is. So satiation deprivation, if a student hasn't been getting a lot of verbal praise, they're in a deprivation state for praise. Your praise is likely to be powerful. Just like if you're in a deprivation state and you're hungry, food is very powerful. Satiation is you've had a lot of exposure to that. I sometimes use edible reinforcers because the students won't really respond, or student won't really respond to anything else for academic performance. I always fade that out. I don't like using edible reinforcers, but I have noticed they lose effectiveness after lunch, because the student might move from a slight deprivation state into a satiation state. Take a look at your students when you're teaching. What are they in a satiation state for? What are they in a deprivation state for? And that's important. That kind of determines the effectiveness of your reinforcers. So contingency, once again, with all the asterisks, and contingent means if and only if, when and only when. So think about the contingencies in your classroom. And then, as always, bribery versus reinforcement. We have to be very cognizant of the difference here. And bribery is you're giving a reinforcer before any behavior has occurred. Reinforcement always occurs after the behavior. So none of this, I'll give you this cookie if you do these problems correctly, that's bribery. You can alert a student to what they're working for, but you don't actually deliver it until the behavior occurs. And therein lies the difference. As we continue on, primary you're already aware of, they have biologic importance. Please avoid these. Unless the student won't respond to anything else as an academic reinforcer, then you certainly might use food or liquids. But I would avoid that if at all possible. Like it says there, temporary. It's distressing to me to see some 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds who have been pretty much skittled their whole life, and that's all they'll respond to. So we need to broaden their horizons so they respond to other things besides a Skittle or an M&M or some kind of tangible kind of thing. Secondary are learned reinforcers. Social stimuli, privilege activity kind of stuff. Most reinforcers are learned. They are learned. We learn that they have power. The categories are pretty simple here. Material tangibles, anything you can, hold in your hand. Limited hold with a radio, something like that. Social, praise, attention, proximity, whatever's powerful socially for that student. Privilege activity, self-explanatory, special jobs in the classroom, line leader, things like that. Proprioceptive and vestibular. Many of our students do respond very favorably to the stimmies. I make rich use of Spencer Gifts because I have found some very cool things in there, like wave machines and rain tubes and other visual kinds of things. Kids who like to be swung around, swings, things like that. That's proprioceptive vestibular reinforcement, and then token reinforcement. So think about really going with the social. It's the most powerful. That's where you want to wind up. And where we ultimately want to wind up is our students get joy from learning. It's self-satisfying. They have tasted success. They want to keep going. So you want to move from artificial to naturally occurring reinforcement. You don't want to stick with the artificial. You really want to get with the naturally occurring. Your praise, teacher attention. It's usually the easiest and best, usually. And just look at all those smiles, gestures, proximities, winks, things like that. It's very powerful stuff. It's very, very powerful stuff for our students. So as we continue on, how do you use your attention to manage behavior? Well, you catch them doing good academically, being engaged without you having to remind them, things like that. You also move. You should really move. Unless you're in a one-on-one discrete trial kind of thing with one individual student, you should be able to move unpredictably about your classroom and scan and then praise, public or private, we've already talked about that, for desirable behavior. The student's working. They're working on that worksheet independently. They're involved over here with this particular activity. They're in this learning station. So praise, public or private, you know your students, you know which ones will be more effective, and then praise for desired responses. And once again, we're trying to teach students what to do academically. We're not trying to teach them what not to do. Don't make that mistake. Don't make this mistake. No, we're teaching them correct responding. And When you think about it, what are your expected responses in your classroom academically? What do you expect academically? What do you prohibit academically? And it's something to think about. So using your attention to manage behavior, effective praise. Once again, we don't say good job 8 million times a day, but it does have that if then, if and only if, then and only then. It also uses students' names. I think that has so much power than just saying, oh, good job, or wonderful, or whatever. They might not even process that. It also is very descriptive. We actually tell the student what is praiseworthy that they're doing. It's convincing and genuine. I'm sure you've seen co-professionals give this half-hearted, yeah, that was kind of good. It's convincing and genuine. It's varied, like we talked about. You don't say the same thing all the time. And it's non-disruptive. When you see the teachers who are really, really good at this, it's just part of the regular flow and rhythm of their classroom. It's not like the world stops because we have to praise the student over here. It's also not too frequent. There are possible negative side effects of too much praise beyond satiation. As an example, we know that with some children, if you keep telling them how smart they are and everything else and how intelligent and brilliant and things like that, they might put themselves on a pedestal and not try anything. They're not completely sure they can actually do completely 100% wonderfully. So there's some negative side effects of too much praise. Types of praise, private and public, you already know the difference, kind of obvious. Vicarious works very well with young children. You have one student who's busily working on the assignment, you can praise that student so other students hear it. So that works really well with young children. It kind of loses effectiveness with older students. Nearby praise is self-explanatory. And then praise while you're just generally helping and teaching. So I think the private versus public is really important here as well. So there's just some types of praise. How do we actually figure out reinforcer preference? And by the way, it can be S plus or R plus. I kind of intersperse them. Observation. Just seeing what the student gravitates towards. Are they a social person, more of a loner? Do they gravitate towards certain objects, certain material things? Observation works great. Menus, just like a menu in a restaurant, student gets to pick. Either a finite close-ended or more open-ended. Concrete menus, I do this very often. I have a student who's not performing academically or not engaging. I'll put everything I can think of on a table, material, tangible, introduce the student to the table. Generally, they'll pick something. So concrete menus are also pretty functional. Surveys, ask somebody, ask the family, ask co-professionals, ask the student, things like that. Interview the student, and then sampling. Having a student actually experience some of the different reinforcers that are out there for good academic acquisition and performance. So that's how we actually assess this stuff. Just remember the individualization of this. We used to think that all students with intellectual disabilities, they definitely all responded to this and this and this. It's very individualized. So what's powerful for one student might not be powerful for another student. We already talked about some students have very unusual preferences. I still contend that everybody likes something. It may be just to be left alone. And I do use escape as a reinforcer for academic performance. And if you can't think of anything else, you might want to try that. So always remember the individualization here. Some other stuff, pairing. You already know about pairing primary and secondary. You already know about always naturally occurring, then the artificial, then thin reinforcement. So praise and then the artificial thing because you want to fade it out. And then generalized condition reinforcers are those tokens, the money system. They're just associated with a whole bunch of different behaviors and many different reinforcers. Think about your paycheck. You don't do just one thing with it, and when you access it, you don't just buy one thing with it. So they're generalized condition reinforcers. The Premack principle makes too much sense not to use academically, and it's increasing low probability by pairing it with high probability. It might be the escape, the break for this particular student. An example for us would be keeping up with required readings, certainly not for this class, but maybe another class, and your high probability is going out. If you ever force yourself to do a certain amount of reading before going out, you just pre-max yourself. So think about, it used to be called grandmom's rule, think about applications to schedule, routine, things like that, in your classroom as well. A low probability followed by a high probability. Mathematics, computer time, spelling, recess, those kinds of things. Premack principle, very, very powerful stuff. So make rich use of that, if you will, during your academic trials. And most important for you to remember in all this stuff, your attention is really where it's at. You know, even with students on the spectrum, your attention, you know, tends to be very, very powerful. Move from artificial to naturally occurring. Use that verbal praise, smiles, winks, gestures. They're very powerful for many, many of our students. So what we're looking at here, just to wrap up this module, is teaching, you know, once again, from a behavioral perspective, we're managing those contingencies that determine student actions. And lastly, we are, you know, since we're managing those contingencies, I really want you to think about the contingencies in your classroom and, you know, what contingencies that you have. You know, you as a teacher, you have contingencies in your classroom rules, structure, predictability, academic routines, not all that stuff that we talked about already, but think about the contingencies that you have. You know, what the students need to do to get praise from you, things like that. So we will see you very shortly for Module 4.